Ndi Igbo kwenu? Kwenu? Kwezone? So, there's no cola, but we'll have to manage with that. So, and just to sort of relate to things that we've talked about today, I don't actually write Igbo, so again, thank you for translating the title, which is really, for those of you who went to a certain school in Owerri that will remain nameless, there was a certain dance group, and we used to say, Nangwanu, Nikenu, Oro. There we are. So that's where it comes from. And I will deconstruct some of that as we continue the discussion, but we're going on a journey. And thank you again to the storyteller, because I really have a hard act to follow, but we'll try. Okay, right. Okay, the image to the right, I'll keep you guessing. At the end of this talk, we'll return to it. But let's say it's within, 10 meters of this building. But this is the introduction. I'm going to talk about Igbo Land and what Igbo Land is, or what I think it is in terms of the geography and the context in which this talk is being given. Then we'll talk about art and culture in context, and then I'm going to go down to these various themes: architecture and design, sculpture and the arts, textiles, music, and performance. One thing that is missing, and I was warned about this, is there's not very much on literature, because I think literature is for tomorrow, so that's a reminder for tomorrow. Come for tomorrow if you want to talk about literature. Okay. So, Igbo Land. One of the issues about Igbo Land is we are within a very large area, which is the whole of West Africa. And actually, interestingly, as has more or less been said, we're what's called much more of an autonomous set of communities. We were not really conquered by the large empires. So you've got the famous Kanem-Bornu Empire, the Fulani Empire, and so on, to Chiadikobi. In our days in Federal Owerri, we did get a lot of history before the colonial period. So these histories, I think, have actually affected what, and rather where and what has become Igbo Land. So we're very much in that corner near the armpit of West Africa. So what does this mean? Well, what it means is that when we come to the colonial period, you can see that the areas of influence of the different colonial masters, actually, when it comes to what is really Igbo Land, which is around here, we've had less of that direct link to trade than some of the, obviously, the coastal communities. And in the north, the Hausa Empire, which was obviously directly linked to Mecca. Having said so, we had to exist, and to exist, you have to have these interactions and trade intersections, and I would say other cultural elements which we will look at as well. If you look at the image to the right, though, I mean, interestingly, this is from somebody called Basden, who was a colonial officer, 1901, in Igbo Land, and he actually extends Igbo Land right down to the coast, which, as we've heard before, certainly since the Biafran War, people here do not call themselves Igbo. But I think the issue is that linguistically, actually, the dialects change a lot at these corners. But I think when we talk about Igbo Land, it's important to consider that in context, because we are different from the other large, if you like, ethnic groups, because we no longer talk about tribes. So the ethnic groups to our left, the Yorubas and the Benis, to the north, well, I guess you've got the middle belt, but the major ethnic group would be the Hausas. And then I guess we have much more in common with the Efik and the Ibibio, which we'll bear that in mind because we'll be coming back to that. And in fact, again, we talked about the Ebe and so on, which actually linguistically crosses between Igbo, Ibibio, and Efik. Okay, so far so good. And just to remind us again about what the carve-up of West Africa meant. Effectively, the British colonies are literally checkerboard between what were German, French, and in the case of Cape Verde, I think that's the only Spanish colony. And that again begins to change things, because once you start having demarcations, albeit they purely drawn up in Berlin, And indeed, Nigeria's name we hear was given to us by, is it Lugard's? Here, it's not even his wife, it's his mistress, apparently. So, you know, we're dealing already with an identity crisis, I would say. So, and indeed, Igbo, I-G-B-O, so there are issues there as well. But anyway, so that's the context to which we're talking. And now we're going to talk about the themes. Drawing to the right, or image to the right, again, Basden. This was the great drum of Orca, and there's a long story about it. I'm encouraging you to go and read more of the historic past that we know. It was probably used in bits of divination and so on to do with sacrifice and so on. So as I said, themes. I'm going to be looking at fine arts, design, music, performance, and literature is tomorrow. So, but what I will really be focusing more on, I think, is the more the performance and the textiles, actually, in terms of art and design, as opposed to necessarily the fine arts, but just to get us into the context, so to speak. What we do know is that we have had, I guess, one of the most illustrious artists of modern-day Nigeria, the late, great Ben Enwo, and that's his famous photograph, Tutu. To the left, though, for those who are more, might be more involved in the arts, Elan Sui's drapery here apparently made the highest auction rate in America about 5 years ago. It sold at something million. Elan Sui is interesting again because he's actually Ghanaian, but he's lived most of his life in Nigeria, and he was part of the Nsukka school. So again, I mean, the idea that the arts are necessarily only in one place, I think I would challenge. And also, I think the beauty about particularly, I would say, Igbo art is that it is, in some ways, it's able to absorb and change with time, which is what's happened in this case. One thing I should have said, which I think is a good time to say it, is that I'd like to actually dedicate this talk to Okudili Enwazo, who unfortunately departed this life this year. I mean, this was very much his space, and again, he was one of the first African art critics in the world. So again, I think this is something we should also bear in mind. So, I mean, so if you like, this is the kind of, this is the arts in its kind of fine and applied fashion today. What I'm going to do next, though, is to take us, if you like, sideways again to talk us a little bit about architecture and design, and then we'll carry the discussion forward. So the fine arts and applied arts, this is the status now. I guess actually most of these were designed before 2000, so it's end of the 20th century. Let's go back to much earlier in the 20th century. And these are some of the only images I'm going to give you of what I'd call three-dimensional design or architecture. I think the issue about particularly Igbo architecture, and indeed this is where the climate comes in, the idea of us having an architecture that I guess stays the test of time, like the kind of historic European buildings you pay your National Trust money to and go and visit, is that our architecture, particularly in terms of buildings, are much more temporal. There's a cycle. You know, normally, this is an Mbari house, I should have said. Normally, they're for particular purposes. We're lucky. We live in a tropical country. We don't need, generally, auditoriums like this. Our housing, so to speak, or where we live, our domestic quarters are much more functional. But what we did have, which again, I guess Christianity has changed somewhat, were these shrines and spaces and places for these objects. But there again, they generally did not last or stand the test of time. There was normally a cycle. So when we now take in the context of, I guess, development, for lack of a better word, a lot of these trades over time disappeared. Also, Christianity meant, as we've already heard earlier today, that for a lot of people, the idea about anything to do with a shrine is just not something to be talked about. But there again, we are not particularly unique. I went to Oshobo for the first time 3 years ago, and a lot of Yorubas will not go anywhere near that. This is the shrine of Shango, and the main priestess was actually a German Jewish lady who became a priestess in her own right. in fact, a lot of Nigerians, full stop, not just Yorubas, will go nowhere near the place. It's fetish, it's that. Well, I'm still standing, so I think, sorry God, but this is culture that we sometimes, well, one thing is that, interestingly, in Yoruba Land, what they say is that it doesn't really matter that she's from Germany. As long as she embraces the religion, she could then be the priestess or whatever. I mean, in this case, I'm not sure how many Mbari worshippers you would find. They used to be, actually, and this is in my own lifetime, I can remember actually going back with my big sister. She would be going back to Port Harcourt to fly out to the UK, and we'd be driving past the old Umuahia Aba Road, past Mbise, and you'd still see these shrines, but they were already almost destroyed. What we should say, of course, about Igbo Land, which again has been said, is that the effect of the Biafran War also had a very serious effect, so to speak, on the objects of culture. So not only did a lot of paperwork and so on get destroyed, but a lot of these buildings did. The reason I'm saying that is because there will be an image again of the main documenter of Nigerian architecture was a Polish architect called Zbigniew Dmowski, who was at the University of Jos. And he did all this documentation before 1966. In fact, if you read the book, and I've got that on the slide, he actually says he had to leave Nigeria at the beginning of the Biafran War. So without this, we wouldn't even have had this record. But there are some changes. This is where we talk about, I guess, what you'd call adaptation and syncretism. This is very near Onitsha, near Asaba. And the discussion here amongst art historians is that these ideas about circles and plastic forms come from the Asaba and Onitsha traders being very involved with trade to Benin. So these ideas of creations and circles, and indeed I think the use of mirrors, they think come from across the Niger. So you get this change over time as well in what is, I guess, true Igbo architecture. But as said again, there are different groups of Igbo Land have different forms of architecture which have to do with the climate. So if you go further north towards Nsukka, there's much more use of thatch. If you go further down, it's much more to do with lighter weight, sometimes right down to the stilts that you find on the riverine areas of places like Calabari and so on. So, I mean, I'm going to leave the architecture there, have another lecture on that another time, but that's the book, and indeed, this is, so, I mean, basically what he did was to do an amazing documentation and photography of a series of these buildings. I think he divided eastern Nigeria into 3 sectors, the coastal area, the north, and then a central area. So it's hard to find, but there's probably a copy in SOAS, if you look, I'm sure. But just going back briefly to art and sculpture, which is where, as I said, I'll be focusing the talk today. Again, this is MWAU, Nigeria Electric Power Authority, Shongo. And then to the front is what's outside the National Museum. But when you read a lot of the art discussion, because there was a major conference on him in 2017, he actually attributes his development to understanding masquerades and so on in his hometown. And my family will know that it looks like he was very involved with Kenneth Murray, who was involved in teaching art at a certain college that some people will know, Government College in Wahia. And they actually began to talk about abstraction of art and the need for Africans to think about art as being something that was separate from just religious art. Because again, the missionaries, they did us really well, but what they did do was also in many ways, as has been said more or less, deculturize a lot of the earlier culture because of its so-called link to whatever, fetishes and so on. And one worked with Murray, and this actually developed his art career. In fact, I think the story is something around he got much better than the teachers and actually went on to greater things. But he's certainly a major figure in African art, or was. So just following on from that and the sculpture ideas, so these, again, this is from that book we've just come through. So what he did was also look at the carvings in existing buildings at the time. So these, again, would be equivalent to, I guess, what the American view of a totem pole. But in this case, these sculptures were both supports for the building, and oftentimes it would be a medicine house or whatever, but also they had this spiritual meaning. And just to bring us back to date, this is actually next door, so I can now begin to reveal. So downstairs, when we went to look at the artifacts that are held by University College London, they have a lot of these, we think they're Ikenga figures, and that's one there as well. So the idea about carving and sculpture, again, is something that Igbos were very into. We had a minor discussion there also about metalworking. And it's known again that certain parts of Igbo Land also had a metalworking tradition. And when we talk about that, and I'll be talking about textiles, some of the issue about colonization again was that what had been a metalworking culture basically got, what's the word? Well, they got bought out by cheap imports from the West. So the idea about metalworking or the ability to do it, the facility has pretty much gone in a lot of Igbo Land. But just to show you that some things go, and I think we actually saw this as well, because this is courtesy, it is Wikipedia. This is Abriba, and these sculptures still exist. So when they're doing burials of important people and so on, these sculptures of human beings this time are displayed in their obu houses and so on, so it still exists. But there are other, I guess, finer things at a much finer scale. This again was from next door. I mean, I guess you'd expect the metal ornament here. That's it's reckoned that a lot of them are from Darrell Ford, who worked with Basden actually as well, because some of the Ikenga figures I could see from the book I was reading. But there's a series of these colonial officers who I guess had more than an interest in African culture at the time. So again, harking to tomorrow, Achebe talks about the colonial officer and his interest in the activities of the natives. So you've got a reed here, which was used apparently to warn people about the masquerade. We're not sure about what this is. I found this really interesting, but again, there was a discussion again about ivory. That's actually an ivory headpiece. So again, back to the idea about the wealth in somebody's wealth and title. If you were marrying a wife and you could actually deck her in ivory, beads, and so on, that shows your wealth, because, again, I don't think we have elephants, or we had elephants in Igbo Land, but we did trade across these different borders. So we know that certainly the beads, actually they can trace right back to Venice. So they come through Venice, onto the Mediterranean, down through the trans-Saharan trade to us, and then we trade, hopefully not for people, but who knows. But, I mean, so this idea about Igbos being, I think, very interactional in terms of, or it's an intersecting place, because we're in the middle, we have to do this trading. But it also then expresses itself in different forms of art. So, for my money's worth, that's probably more than what, 150, 200 years old? And you know, the amount of carving at the end is just amazing. So they probably buy the ivory and then do the carving. So now we're going to segue into, so that's the kind of idea about the kind of art pieces that we know exist historically and archaeologically. What I'm now going to do, hopefully, is to segue into music. So any points for guessing? Who knows who this is? Well, it's at the bottom, isn't it? So, I mean, normally, and we will get to the kind of music that I guess we all normally think about, but I think Igbo Land is particularly unusual in the sense that because we embraced a lot of the religion, we got, I think some of the benefits are people like Harcourt White, For those who don't know, he was diagnosed with leprosy, I think at age 8 or something, and he was then taken on by the leprosy mission, the Presbyterian leprosy mission in Uzoakoli, near Umuahia. And he's one of our greatest exponents of music. And I'm going to see if I can get it to work. Otherwise, pardon me, I'm going to have to go off-piste and see if I can get it done. Just give me a minute. I do have the link, I hope. Here. Let's see. Let's see. Right, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. And fingers crossed, the beauties of technology. Let's put it in, see if it works. Yeah, okay. Oh, we don't want that. Let's skip that advert quickly. Thank you. Right, let's see whether we can hear it. But I think the point here is that, you know, this is somebody whose life was blighted by leprosy. He had to, and he was not actually, and again, actually he's from Abonema, so he's not actually Igbo, but he was in the Igbo area. He got adopted by these, or he got taken to the mission, the leprosy mission, and created this, what effectively is known, I think, internationally. We have actually, I guess, a family friend who was at the Biafra conference, and this is one of his favorites. Pieces of music. So it's gone all over the world. But interestingly, back to our discussion earlier, which I'm going to get to, what was said was that he decided to actually add Ikoli to his name because he did not want to be confused as a white person. So the names that were given presumably were from the leprosy colony, that's Harcourt White. But he then said, no, my name's Ikoli. So, but yes, so, and you know, fortunately he was cured, but I think by then he'd already had bits of his limbs and so on affected, but so he's a really interesting person to think about musically. The other person, again, who those who are, I guess, of my age will remember, the famous Mr. Uduku, created effectively, I guess, one of the first, you could call it an Igbo, at least operata, which is the Afufummo operata. I'm going to see if I can, again, give us a bit of that, if I can get the technology to work. Yep, here we are. So, and interestingly, Thai for Alva Nikoku, he taught music as Alva Nikoku as well. Here we go. Right, so we don't even need to skip the adverts this time. This was so it's actually a direct mix. It's a mix between pure Igbo, but it has very much the English text as well, and it's from a text in the Bible. Which, I mean, again, I think it's it must be at least, what, 50 years old now or something, but it is in the liturgy, I think the CMS Anglican liturgy in Eastern Nigeria, as I understand it. Yeah, I mean, again, so this is the kind of, if you like, the classical music bit that I don't think we normally get a lot of. I mean, what we do know, which is my last piece in this set, is much more to do with, indeed, our friend here. So shouldn't surprise you what it's going to be. Very familiar with this kind of music, definitely. And it's felt that, again, that was one of the, if you like, side effects of the Civil War. That, I mean, if before soldiers were going to the front, although this is much later, the idea about high life has another renaissance in Igbo Land. Because high life proper is really 1950s, but this is happening in Igbo Land 1970s, and is incredibly popular at the time. So, I mean, that range of music, I think, is something, again, that, if you like, culturally, I think particularly Igbo Land has been fortunate in being able to both create, but I think also give to the rest of the world. I mean, the other one, which I could have obviously talked about, would be the famous Sweet Mother. But again, Prince Nico Mbarga is not Nigerian, is he? He's from Cameroon. So this is the thing, you know, but again, I would say Igbo Land becomes this filter for these different kinds of music. And it's not just a certain kind. We're doing a series of other things. I mean, of course, the future might well be Nollywood, but so we've segued a bit. What we're going to go to now is, hopefully, textiles. So, Akwete. To the right is a very old picture of King Jaja of Opobo. And King Jaja of Opobo was, exactly, he was a Igbo slave, captured, taken to the riverine area, managed to work hard, indeed, like our storyteller said, and actually gained his freedom. And then eventually became the ruler of the Opobo ethnic group in what is now the River State. And indeed, he's credited with allowing the missionaries come in because he could see the futility of slavery. So he's both revered. But the point about what I'm talking about at the moment is actually the textile, which is Akwete. And, okay, some people believe Akwete only started when the missionaries reformed it. But the reality is that the loom in which Akwete is produced, which I hope will come through in one of these, because there are different kinds. The loom originally had much more cotton and raffia, and not just the cotton that we associate it with now. But again, another of these stories about colonial history is that, of course, with the import of what was originally Dutch wax, British Manchester wax, you name it, German wax, a lot of these traditional materials, of course, lost their currency. Although, I mean, back to our colleagues from Abriba and so on, there's still the use of these cloths for very important occasions. So again, this is an area that I think we don't necessarily recognize or take into account as much. I would say than our Yoruba cousins who are much more involved in looking at their ashoke and so on. But Akwete has the same weight. The equivalent in Ghana would be the Kente cloth. But I mean, here you are. This is a modern day reconstruction. But I mean, it is still made on the loom. That's the idea. And what we'll be talking about in the last bit is around the idea about performance, where again these materials are now coming back into the way in which we perform if you like, 21st century ideas about notions of performance and culture. But so I would say Equate is this other cultural space, textiles generally, that we haven't really investigated or explored in great detail. So what we're going to do now is go on to communications. So I think we've already had a bit of this from Chiadikobi. And Sibidi to the right. So this is the writing culture. Again, the anthropologists suggest it's more from Calabar, but it's that confluence again between the Cross River and Igbo Land. And indeed, if I was actually sort of steeped in my books yesterday trying to get this together, there's certainly the idea amongst the Abriba that they actually came over from Calabar. So these ideas move across. And the idea about this script, from my point of view, from an educational perspective, I love it, because the idea that there was no education until the missionaries came is absolute nonsense. So, I mean, so this idea about using a script to do more than just decorate was there. And as you say, in the Ikara cloth, this is actually inscribed in the way this material actually works. So it's more than just the material, it's imbibed with culture, spirit, all the other things you want to call it. So I'm sort of now going into the last bit of my talk, which is about performance and how this seems to bring it all together. So